On February 4th, 2026, just hours before crucial nuclear talks with the United States, Iran made a move that sent shockwaves through military command centers from Tel Aviv to Washington. They didn't launch a missile. They did something far more significant. They declared the Khorramshahr-4 ballistic missile fully operational and combat-ready. This isn't just another weapons test. This is Iran fundamentally rewriting the rules of Middle Eastern power, compressing Israel's response time to mere minutes, and making every U.S. base in the Gulf a sitting target for a weapon traveling at Mach 16. Today, we're breaking down why this single missile deployment might be the most consequential military move of 2026, and why its implications stretch far beyond the Middle East, into Asia's energy security and the future of global deterrence. Let's dive in. Before we talk about why this matters, let's understand what we're dealing with. The Khorramshahr-4 is a liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile that represents the cutting edge of Iran's indigenous weapons program. And when I say cutting edge, I'm talking about a system that combines capabilities we haven't seen together in one platform before. The raw specs tell the story. This missile is 13 meters long, weighs around 30 tons at launch, and can strike targets up to 2,000 kilometers away. That's basically every major city in Israel, every U.S. military base in the Gulf, and significant portions of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, all within range. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Khorramshahr-4 carries a warhead weighing between 1,500 and 1,800 kilograms. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 3 times heavier than most comparable ballistic missiles carry. We're talking about a payload heavy enough to devastate critical infrastructure with a single strike. Speed is the real game changer here. During its exoatmospheric flight, meaning when it's up in space, this missile travels at Mach 16. That's over 12,000 miles per hour. Even during re-entry, when it's coming back down through the atmosphere, it's still screaming in at around Mach 8. At those speeds, traditional missile defense systems have seconds, not minutes, to detect, track, and intercept. And Iran knows this. The missile uses what's called a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, or MARV for short. This means that in its final approach, the warhead can adjust its trajectory, making interception even more difficult. It's not following a predictable ballistic arc like older missiles. It can dodge. And the accuracy? We're looking at a circular error probable of 10 to 30 meters. That means this missile can reliably hit within 30 meters of its target from 2,000 kilometers away. For a strategic weapon of this size, that's surgical precision. But the most important detail isn't in the spec sheet. It's where these missiles are stored. Iran has built what they call missile cities, underground facilities carved deep into mountains, designed to survive even bunker buster strikes. These aren't just launch sites. They're survivable command centers that ensure Iran can retaliate even after absorbing a first strike. To understand why Iran is so obsessed with ballistic missiles, you need to understand the city of Khorramshahr. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, Khorramshahr became a symbol of Iranian resistance. The city was besieged, nearly destroyed, and eventually recaptured at enormous cost. For Iran, Khorramshahr represents what happens when you don't have the military capability to defend yourself against a determined adversary. That experience fundamentally shaped Iranian military doctrine. The lesson Tehran learned wasn't build a better army, it was build weapons your enemy can't defend against. The original Khorramshahr-1 missile was first tested in 2017, and from the beginning, Iranian officials made one thing absolutely clear. This was a domestically produced system. They wanted the world, and especially the United States, to know that decades of sanctions had failed to stop Iran's missile development. In fact, sanctions may have accelerated it. Cut off from international arms markets, Iran was forced to develop indigenous capabilities, reverse engineer foreign technologies, and innovate under pressure. The result? A missile program that doesn't depend on anyone else. Each iteration of the Khorramshahr missile got better. The Khorramshahr-Q improved accuracy. Subsequent versions enhanced survivability, and the Khorramshahr 4, unveiled in May 2023, represented the culmination of decades of technical refinement. But there's one more critical piece of this story: combat experience. In June 2025, during a reported 12-day conflict with Israel, Iran used earlier variants of its ballistic missiles in actual combat. They learned what worked. They learned what didn't. They gathered real-world data on Israeli interception rates, response times, and psychological impact. That combat data directly informed the final design of the Khorramshahr 4. This isn't a theoretical weapon. It's a battle-tested design optimized for the specific threats Iran expects to face. And now, it's operational. Here's where things get really serious. Iranian military media made a statement that should have set off alarm bells everywhere. They said the deployment of the Khorramshahr 4 coincides with the announced shift in the armed forces doctrine from defensive to offensive. Read that again. Iran isn't positioning this missile as a last resort deterrent. They're framing it as an offensive weapon designed to impose immediate catastrophic costs on adversaries. This is fundamentally different from how Iran has historically talked about its military capabilities. For years, Tehran maintained that its missiles were purely defensive, meant only to retaliate if attacked first. That narrative is gone. Now, Iran is saying, we have first strike capability and we're willing to use it. For Israel, this changes everything. Israeli defense planners have always operated under the assumption that they would have at least some warning before an Iranian attack, time to scramble aircraft, activate missile defenses, prepare shelters. The Khorramshahr 4 compresses that timeline to minutes. From launch to impact on Tel Aviv, maybe 5 to 7 minutes. That's barely enough time to sound an alarm, let alone mount an effective defense. And it's not just Israel. Every U.S. military installation in the region is now a high-priority target that can be struck with minimal warning. Bases in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, all suddenly much more vulnerable. This creates what military analysts call escalation dominance. Iran is betting that possessing a credible, survivable first strike capability will make adversaries think twice before taking any hostile action, even limited strikes against proxy forces or nuclear facilities. But here's the paradox. Weapons designed to prevent war can sometimes make war more likely. When both sides have hair-trigger systems optimized for rapid retaliation, the risk of miscalculations skyrockets. Let's talk about the timing of this announcement, because it's almost as important as the deployment itself. February 4th, 2026, just hours before US-Iran nuclear talks in Oman, Iran chose this exact moment to declare the Khorramshahr 4 combat ready. That's not a coincidence. That's missile diplomacy. Iran walked into those negotiations having just demonstrated an irreversible military fact on the ground. The message to the United States was crystal clear. We're negotiating from a position of strength, not weakness. These capabilities are non-negotiable. This is coercive statecraft at its most calculated. Iran didn't launch a missile. That would have been too aggressive, potentially derailing talks entirely. Instead, they announced operational status, threading the needle between demonstration of power and outright provocation. And it worked. The United States and its allies were forced to recalibrate their negotiating posture. You can't credibly demand complete dismantlement of a missile program when the missiles in question are already deployed in hardened underground bunkers. This tactic has a precedent. North Korea perfected this playbook: develop weapons, test them, deploy them, then negotiate from a position of irreversible capability. Iran appears to be following the same script. But there's a deeper game being played here. By operationalizing the Khorramshahr 4 right before talks, Iran also sends a message to its own population and regional allies. We're not capitulating, we're strong, and we're getting stronger. In the Middle East, perception is reality, and right now the perception is that Iran holds significant cards. Let's zoom out and look at how this deployment reshapes the regional strategic landscape. For Israel, the Khorramshahr 4 represents an existential level threat. Israeli missile defense has always relied on layered systems: Iron Dome for short-range rockets, David Sling for medium-range threats, and Arrow for ballistic missiles. But those systems were designed around a specific set of assumptions, primarily that incoming missiles would follow predictable trajectories and that Israel would have time to respond. The Khorramshahr 4 breaks both assumptions. Its maneuverability during re-entry makes interception far more difficult, and its speed compresses decision-making time to the point where automated systems must make life-or-death choices with virtually no human oversight. Even if Israel's defenses achieve a 90% interception rate, which would be extraordinary, a salvo of just 20 Khorramshahr 4 missiles could mean 2 successful strikes on critical infrastructure, and given the size of the warhead, 2 hits could be catastrophic. This fundamentally alters Israel's calculus for preemptive strikes. Any attack on Iran's nuclear facilities or missile production sites would almost certainly trigger immediate retaliation with these weapons. The question becomes, can Israel absorb that retaliation and still achieve its objectives? For Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, the deployment accelerates an already intense arms race. Every nation within 2,000 kilometers of Iran is now evaluating whether their current defenses are adequate. We're likely to see a surge in defense spending focused specifically on ballistic missile defense, underground shelters for critical infrastructure, and rapid alert systems. But here's where it gets really interesting for Asia: energy security. About 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Japan, South Korea, India, China all depend on that flow remaining uninterrupted. The Khorramshahr 4 doesn't need to hit an Asian city to hurt Asian economies. It just needs to create enough instability in the Gulf to spike insurance rates for tankers, disrupt shipping schedules, or trigger an actual closure of Hormuz during a crisis. For countries like Japan and South Korea, which import the vast majority of their energy, even a temporary disruption could cause economic damage measured in the billions. And that's before accounting for the psychological impact on markets and long-term investment decisions. India faces a particularly complex situation. New Delhi has expanded defense ties with Israel while maintaining historic energy relationships with Iran. A militarized crisis involving the Khorramshahr 4 could force India into impossible choices. And then there's China. China has invested heavily in Iran's economy and infrastructure. China also has its own advanced missile programs, including hypersonics. The Khorramshahr 4 deployment could indirectly serve Chinese strategic interests by diverting U.S. military attention and resources toward the Middle East and away from the Indo-Pacific. Let's game out a few scenarios. Scenario 1, deterrence holds. Iran's deployment actually stabilizes the situation by making the costs of conflict so catastrophic that all sides back away from the brink. This is the mutually assured destruction logic applied to the Middle East. It's fragile, but it could work. Scenario 2, incremental escalation. Neither side wants full-scale war, but proxy conflicts intensify. Israel strikes Iranian-linked targets in Syria. Iran responds with limited missile strikes on Israeli military infrastructure. The Khorramshahr 4 sits in the background as the ultimate threat, shaping every decision without actually being used. Scenario 3, preemptive strike. Israel concludes that the window to stop Iran's missile program is closing and launches a massive air campaign targeting underground facilities. Iran retaliates with everything it has, including the Khorramshahr 4. Regional war follows. Scenario 4, technology proliferation. Iran begins transferring Khorramshahr 4 technology or actual missiles to aligned actors, Hezbollah, Yemen's Houthis, or even state buyers like Venezuela. This would exponentially increase the threat and potentially trigger military responses from the US and Israel. The most likely outcome? Some combination of scenarios 1 and 2. Deterrence probably holds for major powers, but proxy conflicts escalate, with the Khorramshahr 4 serving as both a psychological weapon and an insurance policy against direct attack. What's clear is that the old rules are gone. The Middle East is entering an era where ballistic missiles aren't just weapons of last resort. They're central instruments of statecraft, diplomacy, and coercion. And the implications extend globally. Missile defense technology, once a niche concern, is now a top-tier priority for every nation within reach of these systems.
The Khorramshahr-4 isn't just a missile, it's a statement. Iran is telling the world that decades of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military pressure haven't stopped its strategic weapons development. If anything, they've accelerated it. This deployment marks a fundamental shift in Middle Eastern power dynamics. Deterrence is now measured in minutes, not hours. The psychological pressure on decision-makers in Tel Aviv and Washington is immense, and the risk of miscalculation in a crisis has never been higher. For Asia, the message is equally clear. What happens in the Gulf doesn't stay in the Gulf. Energy security, shipping costs, economic stability, all are directly tied to the fragile balance of power in a region now dominated by missiles traveling at hypersonic speeds. The Khorramshahr-4 represents the future of conflict in an era where defense technology struggles to keep pace with offense, where underground facilities make preemptive strikes nearly impossible, and where the gap between peace and war can be measured in the few minutes it takes for a missile to reach its target. Whether this ushers in a new era of stability through deterrence or brings us closer to catastrophic conflict remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. Iran has crossed a threshold, and there's no going back.